The space race. In the mid-1950s, the Cold War had pretty much engulfed the everyday life of both countries. The ever-growing threat of all-out nuclear warfare had become an everyday panic for those living in both countries. The construction of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the war in Korea, tensions would continue to grow, and the fear of World War III was boiling under the surface. October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched the intercontinental ballistic missile nicknamed the Sputnik, the world's first ever artificial satellite, the first man-made object to stay in our orbit. Americans were very clearly upset by this. I mean, how could they not be? First and foremost, if they could put a piece of metal out in space, what else could they do? So the United States took it upon themselves to start a race with the Russians to see who could be the first to set a man on the moon. You see, to us, space was the next frontier. We couldn't lose any ground, no matter how big or how small, to the Russians, our enemy. According to the Russians, the Sputnik was capable of launching its own nuclear warhead into the US airspace, although this claim wasn't anything more than a bluff by the Russians to get the US to back down. As we will learn, both sides would play stupid cards to get stupid results that would often work. By the 1958, the US had launched their own satellite into space, known as the Explorer 1, which was designed by the US Army under the direction of Wernher von Braun, who some might have called the father of rocket science. Wernher von Braun is a well-known name during World War II. You see, von Braun had actually been granted membership to the Nazi Party. Under their regime, he had actually worked on the V-2 rocket program, borrowing from journals and plans of the American physicist Robert H. Goddard. He would actually successfully create and launch his own V-2 rocket in 1939. Suffice to say, Wernher had plenty of experience in this sort of thing. Around the same year, the US launched its own satellite. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States, signed in a public order the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, a federal agency strictly dedicated to space exploration. He would also go on to create two national security-oriented space programs that would operate alongside NASA, one of which was part of the US Air Force and the other being led by none other than the CIA codenamed Corona. 1 year later, in 1959, the Soviets would launch their Luna 2, the first space probe to hit the moon. In April of 1961, Yuri Gagarin was the first ever person to be sent into space in the Vostok 1 and circle the Earth. 1 year later, in 1959, the Soviets would launch their Luna 2, the first space probe to hit the moon. In April of 1961, Yuri Gagarin was the first ever person to be sent into space in the Vostok 1 and circle the Earth. The Vostok 1 circled the Earth at a speed of 27,400 kilometers per hour, or 17,025 miles per hour, and it lasted 108 minutes before returning to the Earth in Kazakhstan. This is what Yuri would later state about the feeling of circling Earth's orbit. The feeling of weightlessness was somewhat unfamiliar compared with Earth conditions. Here, you feel as if you were hanging in a horizontal position in straps. You feel as if you are suspended. The success of Yuri began the US effort into sending a man into space. This would be dubbed Project Mercury. First off, the NASA engineers would design a smaller cone-shaped capsule that was far lighter than the Vostok 1. They would test this craft with chimpanzees, and they would then hold a final test flight in March of 1961, before the Soviets were able to put Yuri into space. By May of that year, astronaut Alan Shepard would become the first American in space. However, he would not be in orbit like Yuri. Later that May, President John F. Kennedy would make a bold and public claim that the US would land the man on the moon before the end of the decade. I'm not gonna keep that in. Later that May, President John F. Kennedy would make a bold and public claim that the US would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And by February of 1962, John Glenn would become the first American and second human in the world to orbit the Earth. And by the end of 1962, NASA would launch their lunar landing program, dubbed Project Apollo. January 27, 1967, tragedy struck when the pre-flight test for the Apollo 204, the first Apollo, as a fire swept through the command module. The crew members had been doing a run-through of their checklist, when a momentary increase in voltage occurred, and within mere seconds of this, one of the astronauts would horrifyingly exclaim, followed by 2 seconds of scuffling sounds through their open microphone. The following is an audio transmission of the accident that took the lives of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaff. Viewer discretion is advised. I do not play this for the faint of heart. October 11th, 1968, Apollo 7 would lift off from Launch Complex 35 with astronauts Wally Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walt Cunningham. I tried my best. Their launch was perfect. Apollo 7 would achieve an elliptical orbit 183 miles above Earth. The only issue that the crew suffered from was a cold, which in zero gravity can prove to be absolutely obnoxious, but nothing more. Most importantly to note is that Apollo 7 was the first to be broadcasted live to TV for Americans to see from the ground. After 11 days, they would conclude their journey without a single hitch. By December 12th of 1968, we would finally have a crew capable of not yet landing on the moon, but orbiting the moon and safely departing back to the Earth with the Apollo 8. After an attempt with Apollo 10 without a hitch, it would finally be time for Apollo 11 to make its debut and finally set foot on the moon. July 16th, 1969, Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin would launch from Cape Kennedy into space. The first color TV transmission to Earth from Apollo 11 occurred during the Trans-Lunar Coast, and on July 20th, Aldrin and Armstrong would enter the Lunar Module Eagle, separate from the Columbia, and make their descent to the moon. And like that, we had finally not only put 1 man, but 2 men on the moon. Or did we? That's right, you read the title of the video and probably wondered how long it would take for me to get to this part. Here we fucking are. God, I am just so tired of taking this shit so seriously for so long. I can finally break free of that and I can be myself. So, where do we start? The moon landing is a fucking hoax and we all know it. Obviously, I'm just kidding. I don't actually believe that the moon landing is a hoax. If I did, I'd have a huge whiteboard with a lot of red lines and some crazy floral shirt telling you that I'm not crazy, and I'm just right. The faking of the moon landing is one of those conspiracy theories that, as someone who loves indulging in conspiracy theories, can't help but laugh at nonstop. So let's just go over some of my absolute favorite ones, which is every single one of them. First up, the images that were taken by Neil Armstrong. People love to point out that the shadows on the moon prove that the images were fake. For some reason, they take a look at this photo and they say, you see the shadows of Neil Armstrong and the shadow of the other object just out of shot? Well, they're not parallel. Conspiracy nuts all claim that this proves it, because surely if the sun were the only light source, then the shadows should be parallel, right? This was clearly taken in a studio, and there are multiple light sources, and that's why it's creating different shadow patterns. No. Here on Earth, and really any other world or even a moon that you step on that has a singular light source, like the sun, you'll have this neat little thing called perspective. So suffice to say, thanks to perspective, things aren't going to look parallel, and because you're trying to reduce onto a 2-dimensional plane, a 3-dimensional situation, you can make lines look all kinds of funky. But I don't believe scientists, even if I can recreate this at home. Apollo astronauts could not have possibly survived the Earth's radiation field. The Van Allen radiation belt that surrounds the Earth is in our magnetic field, and it is where high-energy trapped particles from the sun get confined. So within these regions is an extremely high concentration of radiation levels. So how in the hell could astronauts possibly survive traveling through the Van Allen belt without ending up looking like a fucking ghoul from Fallout? According to Professor Oja, if you've ever done firewalking, you'll know that the one thing you don't do is linger around in the middle of the fire pit. You cross as quickly as you can from a science point of view. As long as you walk across quite quickly, looking at the thermal conductivity of your feet, you are not going to have enough thermal energy going into the soles of your feet to burn you. You're absolutely fine. Just don't hang around the middle. In a similar way, the transit time through the Van Allen radiation belt right at the beginning of the Apollo voyages was incredibly short. So, in other words, if you just run through Chernobyl as quickly as you can without taking a moment to breathe, you should be perfectly fine. Just run like hell and never stop once. To me, this makes some sense, but at the same time, I don't know, that's the lamest explanation you could have given me, okay? You could have said something cool, like, well, the suits are actually anti-radiation. They're just cool like that. You want to get it. And fair enough. I don't know shit about the similarities between radiation hazmat suits and astronaut suits. Why are there no stars in the pictures or in the videos? Where are the millions of billions of trillions of stars that we see at night? Before I go over what the official debunking is for this theory, let me tell you a quick story. One time, I was with this girl, super cool chick, right? And I knew she wasn't gonna kill me, so I let her take me out to her ranch to do some stargazing. I whipped out my phone, a real nice and expensive phone, made specifically for taking nighttime photos. Well, that's how they advertised it. And I prepared myself to take some of the most beautiful shots of the night sky. Anyone who knows anything about taking pictures of the sky with your phone might already know where I'm going. Yeah, not a single star was fucking visible. So why is that? Because something that I didn't know is shutter speed. If your shutter speed is too fast, then you're going to end up taking pictures of straight up darkness, which is awful, because even the tiniest bit of movement in doing so is going to end up making your pictures look like someone just used made in heaven. That was my assumption. And as reading it, I actually found that I was pretty fucking close. So, what is the explanation? Well, it's as follows. Both the astronauts are brightly lit up by the sun. So, in other words, this is technically daytime on the moon. So, if you're going to take a photo of a brightly lit scene, your camera's shutter speed needs to be extremely fast and your aperture incredibly small, which is different from my explanation in one way. Where, in my situation, I was taking a picture of the night sky during nighttime. They're trying to take a picture of the night sky during daytime. So I have to take a picture at very slow shutter speeds. They need to take a picture at very fast shutter speeds. You see what I'm talking about? Anyways, moving on. There is no wind on the moon. Yeah, okay, you kind of have to give me a second here, because this one, to me, it's so stupid, but you can almost sit there and do, you go, huh, there isn't any wind on the moon. So how did the flag wave? If there is no atmosphere on the moon, then there is no wind for the flag to wave. Well, that's because the flag isn't actually waving. The flag is actually just so wrinkled from the poor state it had been during the entire flight. It just looks like it's waving. Can I be 100% honest with you? It really does sound like bullshit. Even if you told me something cool like, well, we installed a little motor, so it just, it looks like it's waving, I would still slowly start finding myself agreeing with the tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists, but slower than this. So you're telling me it was folded up for the entire flight in such a way that when it was taken out, it almost looked exactly like it would if there was wind and it was waving? Wind doesn't exist on the moon. It just, look, I'm not going to give the conspiracy theorists shit. And by that, I mean I'm not going to give them a W. But you're kind of doing that yourself, because there's no real way that you can convince them otherwise with this explanation. I'm just saying. If we've actually been to the moon during the tail end of the 60s, how come we haven't ever gone back? Apollo 17 was the last Apollo mission to land astronauts on the moon back in 1972. We just don't really prioritize going to the moon anymore. It's like, okay, we did it. We don't need to go. We don't need to do it again. We've been there, done that, Well, if you ask me, it seems like we faked landing on the moon so that we could stick it to those damn Russians. Look at us. Look how much better we are than you. We put 2 men on the moon. We lost 3 people in the process trying to achieve this mission. We sacrificed the lives of many chimpanzees, and now we are the first to set foot on the moon. What do you think of that shit, Boris Yeltsin? Nah, I kind of get that, to be quite honest with you. Again, not going to give a W to the conspiracy theorists, but why isn't the moon part of our priority? Surely there could be more we can learn from it, right? Look, to really debunk this, let me state this. If it's true that we haven't been back because we never were, why wouldn't we go back because we never were to study the things we never got because we never were? Does that hurt your brain as much as it hurts mine, or does that make at least some sense? Stanley Kubrick filmed it. Back in 1968, a year before the Apollo 11 landing, Stanley Kubrick released the critically acclaimed and absolutely insanely boring film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Mind you, I call it boring, but I named my Alexa HAL 9000, so I do kind of like some aspects of it. Anyways, the film had an absolutely stunning and realistic image of our outer space. It was so compelling that conspiracy theorists would claim that Kubrick worked alongside the government to create the whole set and everything for the faking of a moon landing. When in reality, the reason that Kubrick's 2001 movie looked so good was because he enlisted the help of astronomical artists and aerospace engineers to help him depict the perfect outer space. Or did it end up being that they helped him, so he helped them? All in all, if we were keeping a tally for the amount of times that the conspiracy theorists actually had something that actually sounded so solid that you might be persuaded to believe them, it would be 50-50. I'm not gonna lie. I really just made this video on a whim for the shits and grins of it, and I think by the end of it, I might have found out I'm more of a conspiracy theorist than I let on. That's it for today's video. I know this probably wasn't what anyone was expecting for a video out of me, but this was something I had kind of been wanting to do for a while. I'm even working on one about someone who was mentioned once or twice in this video, and another one that relates to a movie that just recently came out. I know you all are probably wondering where it is. I went for like 9 months, but that's neither here nor there, alright? I'm not gonna get into something that could likely lead to a lawsuit because someone is too scared of the truth coming out, which is why I'm making some really interesting videos going forward. I love speaking the truth and watching as those who try to hide it squirm. Anyways, enough bullshitting. Thank you all for watching. I'll be sure to have a better schedule coming up, and I promise I'll upload more videos as often as I can. I love you all, and thank you for your continued support. See you in the next one. Bye-bye!